Դական աշխատանքներից ոնց կարող է Հայաստան օգտագործի միջազգային օրենքը որպեսզի զենք որ ամրացնի իր անվտանգությունը եւ ինչ ռեսուրս դու գիտես կառնիկ սպիրկում նամանավանդ միջազգային փաստաբանների հետ կապված եւ այլն որ կարող են իրանց գիտական կարողությունը ուժը օգտագործեն հասնենք այդ նպատակին որ օգտագործենք միջազգային օրենքները որպեսզի զենք պաշտպանելով երկրի շահերը եւ ամրացնել անվտանգության կարողությունները
Thank you, Nerses, and thank you to the Office of the High Commissioner for the opportunity to speak to you today. In what is unquestionably one of the most difficult and dire moments in our recent history. It's a moment of existential threat, of torment and trauma, of injustice and indignity, a moment that delivers us back to a collective memory of unresolved injustice, and at the same time pushes us forward into a sea of ominous uncertainty. We stand precariously at the ledge where sovereignty, security, and even our dignity as a nation teeter nakedly. I want to step back for a moment. This state, the Armenian Republic, has inherited a legacy of a magnificent nation. It's a state that bears the name of a rich and historic people, a nation which has governed empires and yet suffered near complete obliteration, a nation whose children have driven the economies of imperial powers and yet whose mothers have died emaciated in Syrian deserts. A nation which has served faithfully in the courts of great kingdoms and whose sons and daughters have spilled blood courageously for national dignity in Sardarapaum and in Shushium. A nation whose sons have delivered the word of God and today even protected man against epidemic and disease. A nation whose traders define the Silk Roads and whose influencers today define information platforms. We're a nation whose children are still born in the mountains of Artsakh and stand on our greatest of national treasure, homeland. The state has been blessed with the magnificence of the whole Armenian nation, and therefore the state's work, especially on national security, must be in service of the whole magnificent nation. National security in the Armenian context is therefore a broader concept than we see in the statist approach typical of traditional nation states. This makes the national security predicament much more complex. But the goal here should not be to define national security in the narrowest sense possible, in a manner excluding the hard stuff, and then claim success. Our national security calculations should be as comprehensive as the nation it serves. And this, even today, especially today, requires this state to stand in defense of Artsakh. International law and human rights are quite visibly at the very core of this national security predicament. And to be clear, the existential threat we faced in Armenia and Artsakh today is shaped by something much, much more complex and sinister than just drones. It's shaped by narratives engineered to undermine sovereignty, to undercut national security, to destroy national will, and to brutally sever the collective Armenian nation from its Artsakh, then from its Sunnik, then from its diaspora, and finally from its own identity. If you don't believe me, look at the maps Azerbaijan circulates to its own soldiers. It includes the land this hall stands on right now. Nothing survives incessant amputation, not even a nation state. This attack on national security is an unconventional one. It's not going to be solved by a peace treaty or even by military force. This is asymmetrical warfare, honing in on the underlying foundations to national security, the identity of the nation itself. I want to explain today how international legal mechanisms can be one of the asymmetrical weapons used to counter these attacks, particularly when a state stands in compromised military or geopolitical positions. These legal mechanisms are essential weapons in the arsenal of every modern state, and they are weapons that can produce actual, tangible outcomes. Let me explain how. While we endure and experience the pain of state creation, of war, of sovereignty, of statehood, of victory and of defeat, of self-determination and human rights abuses, those very concepts themselves, those legal concepts, are in a state of monumental flux right now. These legal concepts are at the core of some of the most fundamental challenges facing the Armenian nation, and they're being shaped, molded internationally as we speak. For example, the concept of sovereignty. It's never been as tantalizing a subject as it is right now, not since the Treaty of Westphalia. Today, the principle of sovereignty underpins the discourse of military confrontation in Europe, the narratives of economic sanctions pitting East and West, the limits of cyber warfare. And it grips Armenia by the jugular, right at the crossroads of the most dramatic chapter in recent Armenian history. When brute force is not an option, how does a state exert its sovereignty? How does it project power? International legal mechanisms offer one key avenue. Armenia's case against Azerbaijan in the International Court of Justice is an excellent case in point. Our team, led by Yegishe Giragosyan, brought the case against Azerbaijan claiming violations of the International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And it explained how Azerbaijan's current violations of international law must be viewed in the historical context of a century of anti-Armenian racial and ethnic hate. The provisional measures ordered by the court, among other things, unanimously ordered Azerbaijan to prevent the incitement and promotion of racial hatred, including by its officials and public institutions targeted at ethnic Armenians. This is crucial. By bringing a legal action, the state translated moral repulsion into a legal obligation. It translated a claim into a directive. It created a tangible asset. It advanced against the narrative of Azerbaijan as a lawful player in the state system. International law is not going to stop an army. We know that. But remember this. This particular battlefront on national security is not about drones or tanks. It's about narratives that underlie and fuel state action. This asymmetric battle takes place on a different plane altogether, and its deliverables are tangible gems that, if used properly, can help buttress diplomatic negotiations and other important state action. Self-determination. This is another example where asymmetric legal mechanisms are valuable. The principle of self-determination has literally transformed in our lifetime. It's no longer the simple tool of decolonization in the 60s. Within the last 2 decades alone, NATO, Russia, Europe, and Africa have all spoken in its name and at the most consequential times in their history. Self-determination is an expanding legal right in international law, richer today than it has ever been before. And of course, It is one of the essential themes that will define the most uncertain and precarious corner of the Armenian experience today, Artsakh. Self-determination is not just about power politics. Brute force has its place, no doubt, but there are international law discourses at the root of these changes. The philosophical origins of self-determination can be traced throughout human history. They have justified the calls for independence and statehood from the French Revolution to the American, from decolonization to Kosovo, and yes, even to the Crimea and the Donbass. National security requires advancing legal themes that lay the groundwork for national interest. How do we promote a legal discourse to allow for our own Kosovo moment, or at least to assure that the fateful red line, that Artsakh cannot be subjected to Azerbaijani authority, is not crossed? You know, there's a reason why we have a natural aversion to the thought of subjecting Armenians to the authority of Baku. Actually, there's a number of reasons. Sumgait, Kirovabad, Ramil Safarov, the stamp that was issued by Azerbaijan displaying an exterminator in a hazmat suit, exterminating Artsakh. A military trophy park showcasing the helmets of fallen soldiers, gruesome mannequins of Armenians for children to mock and degrade. Erdogan praising Enver Pasha at a military parade in Baku in 2020. The message is pretty clear. You know, we shouldn't fool ourselves. But alone, these are just facts. In a legal case, as a narrative, they can lay a crucial foundation as to which of two directions to take in the self-determination question. Is it internal self-determination, or is it external self-determination? Do we have a Quebec situation or a Kosovo situation? Is this a problem with cultural identity or a problem with likely extermination? We know the answer. And it turns out the answer to that question makes quite the difference. Legal arguments tell stories that matter, and certain stories are extremely difficult to ignore. Finally, there's the crucial international strategy that we have yet to fully coordinate and develop. And it's one in which the diaspora can play a direct and crucial role. Human rights diplomacy. It was first raised in the Armenian context by former our human rights defender of the Republic of Armenia, Arman Tatoyan. Human rights diplomacy is a consequence of globalization and draws on efficiency analysis and economic analysis of law, but it can be explained really simply like this. Many norms are extensively globalized, yet they're implemented by a state pursuant to a cost-benefit analysis. States improve their position in the under international public opinion and prove their legitimacy in the global order by demonstrating their accountability to these global norms. A state loses status, of course, in the international community, simply put, when it breaches norms. That's easy enough. In traditional diplomacy, states are the most significant actors that seek national interests such as self-defense and power extension, whereas in human rights diplomacy, the stakeholders are multiplied. There are various additional actors, NGOs, regional organizations, international organizations, and even individuals. Where a state is not able to advocate for key issues in the traditional diplomatic track, alternative human rights diplomacy offers a second track, approaching the same issues through a human rights framework. Consider this. Can we really say that the border issue is really just a state matter? There are human beings whose property rights are involved. Homes, grazing fields, livestock, they're all affected. Personal safety is affected. There are children whose lives are under physical threat on their way to school. This is where human rights diplomacy can serve national security objectives. But the critical element here is coordination. When a state coordinates human rights diplomacy as part of a multi-layered diplomacy approach, providing access, information, and analysis to non-state actors, and allows these stakeholders to make active use of such information in formats and forums that shift public opinion, impact is possible. Without coordination and information, however, the full potential of an organized human rights diplomacy cannot reach its full potential. Legal niceties aside, national security, especially from the legal or philosophical standpoint, in essence, is really about dignity. It's about national dignity. The Artsakh Red Line, for example, preventing Artsakh from falling under Azerbaijani authority and control, is a key component of our national dignity and must be and must remain a key component of our national security architecture. Let's be clear. Allowing the free-fall collapse of a foundational pillar of Armenian nationhood will have irreparable consequences, and peace is not one of those consequences. It will only fuel Azerbaijan's impunity further, leading to ethnic cleansing or worse, and pave Azerbaijan's move toward consolidating its next geopolitical objectives in Sunik, for which it has already laid the groundwork quite openly. Unfortunately, and this is coming from an international lawyer, treaties only pause aggressive states. Treaties don't stop them.
Thank you.